Gex, a sort of poster child for failed video game mascots. Although maybe failure is a pretty harsh term to use, Gex did okay, but he's very much a sign of the time period. We're talking the mid to late 90s here. A wisecracking smartass anthropomorphic lizard is exactly what you'd expect. And in this video I'm going to look at all 3 games that Gex starred in. We haven't seen him for 21 years, believe it or not, so I'm going to go ahead and say this is probably the full collection for the rest of time. The 2 sequels you can see here, which are the 3D games in the series, are pretty easy to find and pick up, so if you ever wanted to play them, you're not going to have much problem. However, the first game in the series, which is the one we're going to look at first, shockingly enough, on the PlayStation, and from what I can tell pretty much any console as a physical copy, is on the rarer side of things. It's never a cheap game. It's not particularly crazy expensive, you're not going to have to get out a mortgage. Anyhow, let's get straight into it and look at Gex on the PlayStation 1. Crystal Dynamics originally developed Gex for the 3DO system, and all things considered, it was a huge success. 1 million copies for the 3DO is pretty damn good if you know anything about the old system, but it must be said it was also a pack-in title at one point. The character of Gex is a wisecracking, TV-obsessed gecko, intended to be a mascot for Crystal Dynamics, and it was used in their logo at the time, pretty much until Gex disappeared. Considering the success of the game on 3DO, they quickly ported it over to the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, which makes a lot of sense. Even by that period, it was obvious that the 3DO's market was quite limited, and PlayStation was wildly successful.
It all started so simply. I had just finished my usual morning routine of nude funkercise, fired up the Barca-Lounger, grabbed a quick bite to eat, and prepared to watch some serious tube.
The plot is all it needs to be, which is pretty simple. Gex is sucked into the media dimension through his TV by the villain who's called Rez. You don't ever really learn much about Rez or his intentions. It seems like the only thing he really wants is Gex to be his mascot. And because he's a bad guy, instead of entering contract negotiations and all that, he's just going to try and force Gex. It doesn't really matter all that much. It's basically a case of, here's your good guy, here's your bad guy, now let's find a game to play in between. And Gex is a 2D side-scroller, fairly typical in its gameplay mechanics. It's one of the 2D side-scrolling games where you have to find certain items before you can progress through the game, so it's not just a case of going from point A to point B. If you find the exit of the level, but you haven't found the item you want, which in this case is pretty much always a remote control, then you're not going to progress, so you're going to have to go back in.
This reminds me of my last few dates.
As expected from a platformer, you can jump, and you can also hold a button down to sprint for a bigger jump. The primary attack is using your tail to whip enemies, and since Gex is a gecko, he can stick to walls, so you can climb around, which is a fairly unique element of the gameplay. There are also orbs littered around which give you temporary power-ups, such as fire breath. You acquire these by using your big lizard tongue. So they've done everything they can here to kind of get the most out of him being a gecko. In action, the controls themselves do feel a little bit stiff. Gex feels a fair bit slower than he should, or at least how I imagined him. It's far from horrible, it's not game-breaking or particularly bad in any way. The controls are just not quite as precise as they could be. Being that Gex is sucked into the media dimension through his TV, the levels are inspired by television and movie settings and genres, although it isn't always super apparent. A lot of the level settings are pretty typical to what you would find in similar games, but I suppose considering the story of the game, you could at least argue here that it makes sense that Gex is travelling through horror-themed areas and cartoon-themed areas with all this crazy stuff going on. It's all happening inside of a television, so effectively you could design these levels however you want without having to worry about any logic. As I said before, you collect remote controls in these levels to access other areas of the game. You access these levels through the main hub or map, which does again add to the semi-non-linear style that they were going for. The original 3DO version used game saves, but unfortunately the PS1 is stuck with just a password system. Now the passwords you find fairly irregularly throughout levels as videotapes, so finding a list of passwords online or using the level select cheat comes in handy as a makeshift save system. It's a fairly big game, there's a lot of levels to go through, so I doubt someone's going to get through it normally in one playthrough. The game as a whole is fun, it's decent, but there's not really much of a reason to go back and play it. There's a ton of examples of 2D side-scrolling games from all time periods which far surpass what Gex is doing. It's a neat idea, it's executed fairly well, but the main appeal is Gex himself. Voiced by Dana Gould, there's a long list of pop culture related gags and quips, which show probably the most personality seen from a side-scrolling character at the time.
Hey, look! SNL!
A few years later, we get Gex 3D, Enter the Gecko, which I believe in North America is known without the 3D, it's just Gex, Enter the Gecko. It's the second Gex game, we can just call it Gex 2 from now on to be easy. So, Rez is back, that's the evil bad guy. Gex is kidnapped and convinced by government agents to once again do battle with Rez in the media dimension. I don't really know what it is Rez does that's so terrible, but the government doesn't want him around, and now it's just an excuse to make Gex a more secret agent style character. Now the basic idea from the first game is still here, but now it's all been translated into a 3D environment, more in line with what was popular at the time period of the mid to late 90s. There's a lot of obvious inspiration from Super Mario 64. You've got a main hub area where you can access all the different levels from. Here you jump into giant TVs to stick with the theme of the game. The main hub itself is difficult to describe, but it seems to be just sort of floating in this endless void with old marble-style architecture. I don't know how this is supposed to scream media, television, film dimension, but that's what they've gone for.
You're driving me sane.
Remote controls are once again the main item to collect, and you get a list of objectives you can complete in each level in order to obtain a remote control. Most of the levels in the game require a certain number of remote controls in order to access, and boss levels have to be beaten in order to access more areas of the main hub. So pretty much all straight out of Mario 64 and other platformers.
Shut it.
So the game isn't exactly bringing anything new to the table. In 1998, it's very much at risk of being lost in the shuffle. In the North American release, Gex is still voiced by Dana Gould, but now, here in the UK, we get veteran actor Leslie Phillips.
Hit me. Go on, hit me. Nice one.
His voice goes in a completely different direction to the North American version, and therefore the first game. Personally, I'm not too sure the voice matches Gex as well as the North American version.
Darling, sweetie.
The level designs are now maybe a little bit more obviously inspired by TV and film franchises specifically, and do a fairly good job in representing them. The levels are fairly open plan, so you can just select whatever objective you want to complete in order to obtain that particular remote control. Although there are quite a few examples of levels where essentially it's just going down 3 different paths. The level will be fairly linear, and then there'll just basically be a fork in the road and you'll pick which way to go and it'll be linear from then. So they haven't really taken full advantage of the potential of this kind of platformer. There's definitely a feeling that the designers were a lot more comfortable making linear levels than open plan ones. But that's not to say that they aren't fun to play through. Most of the puzzles and platforming segments are pretty good. They're fun to play through, if a little bit simple, but the unique settings of each level help make it feel a lot more fresh than it actually is. The visuals are definitely a massive help. Gex has kept pretty much all his moves from the 2D game, with the addition of a jumping kick, which is pretty powerful, and that he can now constantly bounce along on his tail, which kind of reminds me a little bit of DuckTales on NES. It's a solid and varied moveset that doesn't feel like too much or too little. I would never say you ever feel under or over equipped for any situation the game puts you in. So I suppose in a way you could say once again, the main appeal is the character of Gex himself, with his gameplay now being a big part of it. Perhaps the main issue you'll encounter is the camera. Now you do luckily have full control over it, but that doesn't always work, especially when it gets caught between any walls or solid objects. Sometimes you just kind of have to make a leap of faith and hope that it works out. A little bit frustrating, sure, but it's far from the worst example of bad camera positioning in games from this time period. And one really positive thing, every time you leave a level, you get the opportunity to just save your game. A small thing by today's standards, for when the previous game relied on passwords that you had to achieve objectives to obtain, just being able to put the game down whenever you want and come back to it without losing any progress is a godsend.
Ravishing.
Enter the Gecko took Gex into the world of 3 dimensions, and was followed up the very next year by the 3rd game in the series, Deep Cover Gecko. In some areas this is known as Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko, and in others it drops the 3 and it just goes with the subtitle. At this point you can pretty much guess what the story is going to be. This opening cutscene gives you all the story you need.
And that's how the cabinet minister got his trousers back. What's this? Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been handed some late-breaking news. Special Agent Extra, head of the TV Terrorist Defense Unit and star of many of my private dreams, is apparently missing.
Jumpin' Jerry Springer.
Agent Extra was last seen wearing 8-inch heels and a red bathing suit. Her current whereabouts are unknown.
Gex. Gex.
Agent Extra. You poor kidnapped minx.
Hey, Tiger. Guess where I am? Trapped in the media dimension. Rez is back, and he's kidnapped me to get to you. He's attacking your secret island cave.
Hey, speaking of secrets, you want to see my...
Gex, quit clowning around and get me out of here. This place is giving me the creeps. Just dial me in.
If you're calling from a touch-tone phone, please press 1 now.
Gex, listen up. Keep your watch
It's
on
pretty
all-
impressive that Gex got himself a smartwatch in 1999. This lizard was ahead of his time. Rez is back again, and as per usual, we don't see much of Rez. He's barely featured in the game. He's barely featured in any of the games, to be honest. He's more of an afterthought, rarely being seen or mentioned. Once again, the only real star of the show is Gex himself, who for the UK release has once again got a new voice actor.
I'm going out now, chaps.
This time it's Danny John Jules, who a vast majority will know as playing the cat from Red Dwarf. He's a much better fit for the look and personality of Gex, in my opinion. Deep Cover Gecko primarily just expands upon the previous game. Nothing has dramatically changed in terms of gameplay or objectives, but there is a lot of noticeable refinement. Straight away, you can notice a lot more effort put into the design of the hub world. This is now Gex's secret hideout mansion thing. Think like Batman, but kind of not. Like why Gex has an ancient pyramid, a boxing ring, and so on, I have no idea, but it's way more interesting and is almost like a whole level in its own right, with a whole bunch of secrets and hidden areas. It's definitely an improvement over the second game's weird void land, and just has more of a personality, kind of like the castle in Mario 64. Gameplay is essentially the same, it controls identically, but now you do find some level-specific vehicles and costumes you can control, which give you some extra abilities thrown in. Gex can also now swim, although the controls are a little bit awkward, kind of tank-like. So as is tradition in any platformer, underwater levels are not particularly fun. There are also more collectibles in the game. We've still got the remote controls, which serve much of the same purpose as before for unlocking new levels and areas, but there's also B coins, or bonus coins, which open up bonus levels. And paw prints, which add extra hit points or hit paws to Gex's life every time you collect 25 of them. And that's a permanent increase as well. So a very light element of character progression and leveling up, so to speak, going on in Deep Cover Gecko. This is definitely peak level design for the series as well. There's a lot less instances of there being sort of 3 separate linear paths disguised as an open plan level, like in the previous game. Now there tends to be 3 fairly specific objectives. Still fairly simple stuff overall, but definitely the most ambitious they've been yet, and taking more advantage of it being an open level. The stages are around 20% larger, and are very impressive looking for a PS1 title. We've also got more characters featured in the game. It's not just Gex and Rez being naughty off screen. You've now got Alfred, Gex's butler,
Please, sir. Kill critical package before time runs out.
and also Cuz and Rex, who you can unlock as actual playable characters, but only for bonus stages, and they work the exact same way that Gex does.
It's tail time.
But it's still nice that they started to introduce a little bit more into the Gex universe, even if it did turn out to be too little too late.
Mummies and secrets. It appears that they go hand in hand. Taste my tail. I know this stuff. I was a new romantic.
Deep Cover Gecko wound up being the final game in the Gex series, which is a real shame because Deep Cover Gecko actually starts to show a lot of potential.
Is anyone home? Can you tell me what rosebud means?
To put things into perspective, Square Enix now owns the rights to the Gex series, and they've gone ahead and said that any developer can come forward to make a game based on the franchise. That was 5 years ago, and so far, no one's bothered. The first game in the series came out in 95, and the last game in the series came out in 99. That leaves Gex's lifespan at around 4 years. He never came back after that. It's a shame really, it feels like each game is just running a little bit behind the times. If each one came out a year or two earlier than it did, then perhaps Gex would have made a bigger mark on the industry and could have survived to this day in some form. But that didn't happen. Instead, we got 3 fairly decent platforming games that got better and better over time, but fell short just before they could get really good. I'm a fan of the series personally, but I can't tell whether that's just because of nostalgia or because they're actually good quality games. All I can do is sit back and hope that maybe someday someone will try and resurrect Gex in some form.